Dear me. I first knew Bryan when he was a student at Oxford. We overlapped for about 3 years, but he was working on the Bass Rock and I was working on the Pembrokeshire Islands, so we hardly ever met. He then moved on after a bit to Galapagos, where I followed him, not deliberately, but the way it turned out a year later. And these two pictures here, Bryan as being, worrying about his appearance, and me worrying about my stomach. We then moved on, and both of us to be working in this part of Scotland. There's a further connection. That's Sarah Wanless there with a gannet, Bryan's only research student on the gannet. She was on Eels of Craig, where I visited her in the mid-1970s. On the right there's Bryan, Becky, and Sue Lewis, who was Sarah's PhD student on gannets. So there's a long tradition in our family of looking at gannets. And I say that because Sarah and I are these days married. We've kept going. She has been working on the Isle of May. That's her there with her arm down a puffin burrow, or showing how long a puffin burrow is. And then on the right, there's the papers which we've been, with Stuart Murray, who was also in the audience, because we've organised a decadal account of all the seabirds, all the gannets in Britain and Ireland. So that's my link to this. Now, on to the business in hand, the puffin. The puffin is a northern species. You'll notice its scientific name, Arctica. We're at the sort of fringe of the range. It's been quite well studied at a whole range of places. The main study sites are going there. But the thing to bear in mind, the puffin is a very common bird. Throughout this talk, we've been talking about declines and threats and wrecks and everything else. But it's still one of the commonest seabirds in the North Atlantic. So we need to keep some sort of perspective on it. There's an awful lot of puffins in the world. Our best estimate is there are about 20 million. So it's quite a common bird. It varies rather little through its range. The puffins in the southern part, like here on the Isle of May, are a bit smaller than those when you get further north. This is in Spitsbergen. The habitat there is very different. They have to wait around in the breeding season until the ice and the snow is melted before they can get down their burrows. And you can see, if we think that our puffin's got a big beak, the very northern one has an enormous beak. Once upon a time, they thought they were subspecies. Now it's just thought that it's a gradual climb, with small puffins at the southern part of the range and large puffins in the north. So how many puffins have we got? That's our best estimate. And don't let's get too dogmatic about this. The number of noughts on the end of these figures are correct. The others are a bit touch and go. For those of you, I will tell you now, for those of you who read any of the press pre-releases of this, they got it wrong. The reporter got it right, what the copy she filed, they got it wrong. What it should have said was there are 500,000 pairs of puffins in Scotland, another 100,000 in the rest of Britain, and a total population of 0.6. In fact, what she said, there was an extra million in England and Wales, and that's just not true. So anyway, you can add them up, and you can see that Iceland is the center of the puffins world. And to be absolutely honest, they will admit they really don't know how many puffins they've got. But it's somewhere in these millions. Then we come down, working our way through Norway, Britain and Ireland, and so on. We say then about 6 to 7 million pairs, about 20 million individual puffins. So again, I say a common bird. When you go back in history, there's some glowing accounts of puffin numbers, and this points out one of the problems in assessing the numbers of puffins, especially in the past. I won't read that out, so you can read it for yourself. And it's some fantastic prose, is it not? And you'd think, God, they were everywhere. But the picture there was taken just about 5 years ago on the Isle of May. Just puffins flying around, and not an enormously large colony. And if you'd never seen a puffin before, I sometimes wonder if you would come up with these sort of descriptions. That's on St Kilda. then this was written about the Sheeans in the Minch. And there are indeed an awful lot of puffins on the Minch, and they're very impressive. But that picture above was taken, again, about 10 years ago. That's the Farne Islands, in fact. And I've never seen anywhere in the world more puffins than you get in that picture. So what we have is some really eye-watering accounts of puffin numbers. We're unsure how much we can believe them, because nobody ever thought of counting them. They thought it was quite impossible. So the first count was in 1969, 1970, called Operation Seafarer, which was an attempt to count all the birds, the seabirds in Britain and Ireland, and was remarkably successful. That's the distribution of, oh, sorry, I've missed out on this one. This is what the distributions, as was thought about 150 years ago. Puffins were quite widespread. There weren't that many in the North Sea, and if you look, there's none at all around the Firth of Forth in this part of the world. So that's all we have on. We've got these grandiose accounts of numbers, and we've got the country aviafaunas, which Holloway put this map together from. So this was Operation Seafarer. Plenty of puffins there, more than we perhaps would have expected from the map we've just seen. But there were many, many fewer than anticipated, and the declines were particularly marked in some of those colonies which we've just mentioned, the Sheeans and St. Kilda. And there were many, many fewer puffins there, and people started to panic. And we looked in then in more detail. If you go back into the literature, you can get some idea of when the puffin populations decline. I think we can assume that they have declined. We're now interested in the timing of the decline, even if we can't really get an accurate handle on the rate of decline. And if you look down there, you can see a general thing moving from South Grassham up to the Sheeans. Gradually, the declines move north. Again, we can add 10 or 20 years to some of these dates, but you can see it's quite obvious that things are moving further north. And when we get past Britain, when we get into the Faroes, and certainly the major colonies in Iceland and Norway, there is no suggestion that numbers declined at this time. On the other hand, I do wonder if we would actually have known or not. We can then look at these colonies and try to say, well, why have the numbers declined? And if you go to colonies, you can find out all sorts of things. For instance, adults were killed for food. We know about St. Kilda and the bird fouling, but almost everywhere they occurred, they were taken in numbers. They were then eggs were taken for food wherever they could be found. Rats get at them. They were shot at sea. Rats got at them. Cats and foxes have got at them wherever they are. And these are some colonies where we know that's gone on. And they were drowned in nets, there were pollutants, there were habitat destruction. So there's a whole range of things. Almost everywhere you went and people talked about these declines, they came up with a reason. The problem is that those reasons varied from colony to colony. We were looking for some overarching explanation. So this was a time, I think we can assume that most of the declines occurred in the first part of the 20th century. And this was a time of considerable change in the oceans and in the climate. Climate change is nothing new. It's happened before. And at this time, the waters of the North Atlantic were getting gradually warmer. And we've already said that the puffin is a cold water species. And it is then perhaps not surprising that puffin numbers had declined. And we think that it was acting through the food supply. Well, the result of this Operation Seafarer was very good for me because there was a panic on of what had happened to our puffins. Money was short in those days, but nobody can say no to a begging puffin. And the money was produced for somebody to go and look at this problem. I'd just come back from a long stay in Galapagos, and I managed to get this job. So that kept me going for the rest of my career. What I actually did was to decide I would take a colony where we knew that the puffins had declined and compare it in some detail with a colony where we thought they were doing very well. Initially, I started on the Sheeans, the islands in the Minch, But those had black rats. They've just been removed this last couple of years, but they have black rats there and they were getting in the way. So we then moved on to St Kilda. And St Kilda is a fantastically beautiful place, a real bugger to work in. The weather's terrible, there's mud and everything, and you can see the logistics. So it was a large colony, it was declining, and it was remote. And you can see there, we're working on here, it's about a half-hour's walk from here to there. We then went across with Stuart Murray, who's here now, with a breeches boy to work. So it was an hour and a half before you could get into the field, and it's usually raining. In contrast, the Isle of May, we lived there and we worked there, about 100 meters, 100 yards apart. So a very efficient way. And we chose this because it was one of the few colonies in Britain where the numbers of puffins were known to be increasing. So the idea was simple. If you could then find where the differences in the biology of this species was, we could start to look for a cause. So the conclusions were, again, Stuart and myself, the main decline of St Kilda was 47. By the time we got there, numbers had stabilized. We spent several years counting all the burrows, which is the best way to get an estimate of your population. And we came up with, we decided that, in fact, it was these oceanographic conditions which were probably important. Even when we were looking at them, when we think the conditions were better than they had been, they were still nowhere near as good as they were on the Isle of May. History of puffins on the Isle of May is very unusual. When you get puffins in very small numbers, 5 pairs, 10 pairs, they almost always nest in cracks in sheer cliffs to get away from birds of prey, gulls, foxes, or whatever. And this was the case on the Isle of May. There were about 5 pairs. Up in 1960, there were sort of 20. And then large numbers came in. Initially, we know from rigging that they came from the Farne Islands, 100 miles to the south. But numbers have then increased absolutely dramatically. And when we got there in 1972, 73, there were about 2,000 pairs. And they then increased and increased and increased up to a peak of about 80,000. But we'll come back to that later. So we had this immigration from there, but we were able to show that after a few years, the population was self-sustaining, and it could increase by 10% per annum on its own output. Why would the puffins have suddenly increased? Well, there are two things, one of which the island was sort of farmed when the lighthouse keepers and family were there. They farmed rabbits commercially and sent them off. They had ferrets on the island, there were sheep, there were goats, there was disturbance, there were dogs. And puffins, I guess, couldn't cope. Once the population of humans was removed and just lighthouse keepers were left, which tended not to leave their lighthouse very much, peace and quiet came and the puffins took off and increased. However, of course, there must have been an adequate food supply for them to do this. And this has occurred in several other places in the North Sea. So the North Sea at this time was an extremely good place to be a puffin, probably the best place anywhere in the world. Right, so that's when I came on the scene. So what happened to puffin numbers from then on? We've had 2 big surveys since, one in the mid-80s and another called Seabird 2000, centered around the year 2000. And those are our best estimates of the puffin populations. And this is why I was saying that the papers got it wrong, that in fact the bulk, about 500,000 pairs of puffins in Scotland. We will return again to counting puffins. The best way to count puffins is actually to count holes in the ground. And that's really hard going, of course. So about 80% of the population of the British is based on these burrow counts. The others are based on just counts of birds around and about the place. And you can see that the increase continued up to about the year 2000. And not a dramatic increase, but obviously things were going up. And there were still lots and lots of colonies around. And you can see the Isle of May here is now one of the biggest colonies in Britain. In fact, it's almost as big as St Kilda. And this was the place 50 years ago at 10 pairs of puffins. Anyway, so there's still good numbers of puffins all around the north and the west. Now, it's much harder, and we will again return to this because we need another count to actually decide what's gone on since. My estimation, my impression, based on the counts we've got and I've talked to people, is the numbers in Scotland have declined slightly. England has declined, and that's mainly around the Farnes and Coquet Island. There's very few puffins anywhere else in Britain now, in England now. Wales has increased and is still increasing at a very fast rate. Ireland, it's probably increasing. I put a question mark there because people just say it's increasing, but I've not seen the evidence. So at the moment, we're thinking that almost certainly puffins are now in a period of decline within Britain, but we need more information. Right, so we need a little bit, having got that out of the way, we need a little bit on the biology of the puffin so we can perhaps understand what's going on. They first breed when they're 5 years old. We've got an odd one breeding at 4, but most of them don't breed until they're 7. They come back to land sometime before then and get a burrow. They have a very high survival rate of adults. At least 90 or 95% of adults alive 1 year come back to breed the next year. We know that they get senescence. There's two sorts of senescence, one of which is just mortality. As birds, as many other things, as they approach old age, the mortality rate increases. But also they have reproductive senescence in as much as the birds come back to the colony but don't breed. And they just hang around. And they always come back to where they were. We think that if we lost a puffin from a colony for a year or certainly 2 years, we can be pretty sure that it's dead. And they often do spend a few years, as I say, senescent. The oldest puffin we've got on the Isle of May is 34 years. There's a 39-year-old one on the Sheehan's this year, and it's 41 years is the record in Norway. And these are, in fact, we used to mark birds with fairly soft metal rings, and they wore out before the birds wore out. So these records now really are just going back until we had stainless steel rings, which we put on birds, which would outlast the bird. And these records will be broken certainly in the near future. Okay, we said puffins come back. They come back in the spring. They come back in this part of the world in May, whereas in the far north they don't come back until, in March. They come back May further north. They pair up again. They usually keep the same burrow and the same mate, but there is about a 10% divorce rate from 1 year to another. They then, oh dear, pressed the wrong one. They then clean out the burrow, because that's caved in or whatever. They lay just a single egg, which is white, but with some sort of faint markings, which we think is ancestral, because most other auks, like razorbills and guillemots, have these coloured eggs. They just lay one. If they do lose it, they will lay a replacement that year. They have, in fact, got 2 brood patches, so they could, in theory, incubate 2 eggs, but they never do. The egg is sat on for about 6 weeks. This furry thing appears. 6 weeks later, it goes to sea, and it's fed in the burrow all this time by the adults. The big advantage of nesting down a burrow is rather on a cliff, is that both adults can actually go to sea to feed the chick while the chick is safe down the burrow. Well, food is obviously critical to all these things, so it's important to know what they're eating. And puffins have a big advantage over many other things. You can see what they're feeding their chicks on. We should say at the moment, we have rather little evidence, rather few data on what they eat themselves during the breeding season. We assume it's what they feed to the chicks. But in the winter, they do eat some planktonic crustacean and things as well as fish. But at least in Britain, they virtually never feed the chicks anything but fish. So there's a very easy way of doing this. You stick some mist nets up across the colony. The birds fly into them. You grovel on your hands and knees and find all the little fish. You take them back to the lab, weigh that load so you know what. We then weigh the load, we measure each fish, and we can then sort of start to decide on the diet. And the bulk of the food, we'll come in a second, are sand eels, the youngest stage of sand eels, usually 1 year old, usually not fish of the year. Or at the other extreme, quite big sprats. And on the Isle of May, these are the proportions from the start of my study of sand eels and sprats. And you can see almost all years, the black ones are sand eels. This is the bulk, 80%, 70-80% of the diet. And as there's less of these, there's more sprats in the diet. They will eat a whole range of other species of fish. We've got a list, I suppose, of 20 or 25 species on the Isle of May, but they're all absolutely trivial, important in the diet compared to this. So we know the way to the loads, and we can then we can do some feeding watches and find the feeding frequency, and we can add the two together to get some idea of the conditions the puffins are having to cope with. Now, although you're probably, if we go back, there's no great trend there. I mean, it varies from year to year, but obviously sand eels are almost always the predominant prey. And this is the picture, of course. But interestingly enough, we picked this up before the fisheries people picked it up, that over the last 4 decades, the average size of a sand eel, which the puffins have brought back, has come down quite dramatically from sort of 8 to about 5 centimeters. Now, as the fish gets smaller, I take the other way around. As the fish gets longer, its weight increases as a curve, not just as a straight line. So what happens with here is that this is reduced, and the energy, each fish now is worth 40% less in energy terms than it was before. So though the diet might not have changed, the calorific value of these loads has, and the value to the chicks has declined. People always ask, I'll short-circuit it from the questions, how do puffins manage this? If you look inside a puffin's beak, you can see it's got denticles pointing backwards. It's got a big fleshy tongue, and the beak is sort of hinged here. And between these three things, it means they can hold 3 or 4 fish and add another and add another. That's fine. The record that I know of to date is 81 fish dropped by one puffin. Okay, so how the hell do you get in, 79, 80, and 81 without dropping 1, 2, and 3? But people always want to see puffins with lots and lots of fish. That's not what a puffin wants. If you see a puffin with lots and lots of small fish, it's in trouble. Because what a puffin wants is 1 or 2 really big fish like these. If you get a lot like this, that's a sand eel. These, in fact, are young gobies, which are transparent and they're virtually nothing but water, so fairly useless as food. And if you look at the number of fish per load in a year and the weight, you can see it's gone the wrong way. You might think that the more fish you are carrying in a load, the bigger that load, the heavier that load. And it's the exact opposite. The puffins really just want 1 or 2 big fish of high calorific value, come back 3 or 4 times a day, rather than playing around with these silly little loads of fish, which are worth, well, a sprat like that will weigh about 40 grams, or 2 of them, 40 grams. These will weigh about 1 gram. So it's a complete waste of time. So if you see puffins with lots of small fish, don't say, just say sorry, that they are beginning to struggle. Right, the end of the season, baby puffin goes off on its own. It used to be said that it went off on its own because its parents fed it up and then left it, deserted it. In fact, it's the complete opposite. The chick deserts the parents when it's ready. If you have a puffin chick in captivity because for one reason or another, it's lost its parents or whatever, it'll sit quietly in a box for about 6 weeks. But when it's about 38 days old, it won't stay there. It's determined to get out and get away. And that happens here. What happens is the puffin chick goes at night, and they go at night so they can be safe from gull predation and things like that. When they can, they fly away, otherwise they've got to walk to the sea. And the parents come back the next morning with a lot of fish. Junior's gone. They learn very quickly. They stop bringing fish, But at least on the Isle of May, they continue visiting that burrow for 3 weeks or so. Burrows in a puffin colony are in very short supply and are very desirable. And birds hang around as late as they can to keep possession of their burrow ready for the next year. So we followed the puffin reasonably well, reasonably easily, hard work maybe, but fairly straightforward on land. But when it goes to sea, we have a whole different set of problems. Right, it goes to sea like this. We've just seen that. It comes back, a very, very few puffins, maybe 1% come back when they're 1 year old. A few more come on the sea, round and about, and look at the place, but don't come back. And you see it's starting to develop a puffin beak. And it looks a bit like a puffin. I hope you can see that that's a very black, and that puffin is just molted. It's come back at the end of the season. It's just a year old, and it's just replaced all its feathers, and it's nice and smart. Gradually, the second summer, it's still very obvious that it's an immature, and it takes it 4 years before it gets what we would think is a full adult beak. And you can age puffins by the number of bill grooves. We'll have a better picture in a minute. You can see there's 1 groove there, 2 grooves, 3 grooves. That means that puffin is at least 5 years old. This one has, in the second summer, just almost forming 1 groove. So we can age puffins like this, and it takes puffins this long to get into full breeding. You never find a puffin breeding when it's got less than 2 bill grooves. Nobody's looked at it, but presumably it's some social signal. But anyway, somebody else to do, not me. And Bryan used to like this sort of thing. I'm not really turned on by behavior. But it is useful, and we have a sort of short-circuit method of assessing the health of a puffin population. If at the end of the season, when all the immatures are back, and you go through a whole lot of puffins, I don't know if I can convince you or not. Whoops. You can see that one there's got a rather pointed beak, and this one's got a nice curved beak. I can tell you that's an immature, and I can tell you that's an adult. And we can go through a whole lot, and we can work out the sort of proportion of immature puffins, the birds which will come back in 1 or 2 years to breed. And I can tell you at the moment, the puffin population on the Isle of May is pretty healthy. There's lots of immatures about to become mature, so the population is in reasonably good shape, I think. Most seabirds come back to where they were bred, and if you're a seabird and you go out and you've got to decide where to come back and breed, other things being equal, you're better to come back where you were raised yourself, because obviously that's a good place to rear a chick. But many seabirds, and we now know puffins, visit lots of colonies in these 5 years, or 3 years, 5 years of immaturity. And they go round, in fact, in the case of the puffins, they go around Britain looking at colonies. We colour ringed over the years. Whoops. You can see 1,500 puffin chicks. 52 of these have been seen at other colonies around Britain when they're old enough to be breeding. So these birds have settled away from where they were reared. There's one up to the Faroes, and there's one other which was, in fact, not ringed on the Isle of May, but was ringed on the Farns, which is now breeding in, or has bred in Norway. So there's a tremendous movement between colonies, and puffins and guillemots and everybody else, gannets, seem to go around and decide where to breed. And other things being equal, they come back to where they started. But about 30% of puffins, we think, which survive to breeding age and are breeding away from their native colony. These are just 2 puffins which on the Isle of May. We did a lot of this by having different colours for this. That's an Isle of May colour, and that's a craigleaf colour, and this was taken on the Isle of May. So this was a bird. This is an immature coming in and deciding whether to stay here, or presumably go back to craigleaf. Right, puffins in winter are a bit different. In fact, they're so different that at one stage they were thought to be separate species. This is a bit of this is an artifact. This obviously almost a con. This was taken in the breeding season, not in the winter, but it was just to show the difference. And this is one of these birds which you think are senile. This is a female. And the bird fowlers especially the Faroes, used to catch some of these, and they looked inside, and they were always barren old females. So this is presumably is a senile. But anyway, that's just to show the differences in the face pattern and rather washed out legs. Right, Puffin's beak. Puffin's head. It's got a really nice, this is a fully adult, and it's got, you can see it's got one really good bill groove here, it's got two here, and it's got the trace. It's got a nice set of eye ornaments. It's got a nice patch here, a patch here. And in the winter, that falls off, 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 that doesn't. And you end up with, oops, you end up with that. And I apologize, it's not a living one, but I don't have a living one. And you can see, perhaps, you can understand why. The first ones of these, in fact, described as a separate species, were unusual because they were in the Mediterranean. And some puffins from West Coast colonies go into the Mediterranean. This was in the Mediterranean, and they were thought to be. And you can obviously see it's lost its eye ornaments. This has remained the same, so you could always age them. 1, 2, 3 really good bill grooves. This is shriveled, so we got from that to that. Right, so puffins are different in the winter. Where do they go in the winter? And we really got, for a long time, with very little information. You just don't see them at sea at all. Ringing recoveries are one way of getting at this, of course, and these are recoveries of puffins which were ringed on the Farne Islands here or on the Isle of May when they were recovered. And you can see most of them were here. We thought that a few of them had gone through the Straits of Dover. And these were quite late on, when the puffin populations had increased dramatically in the North Sea, that we thought puffins may be being forced out. And these few are over here, we rather discounted. We thought, well, these are puffins which have sort of settled out somewhere else, having started off on the Isle of May or on the Farnes. However, the development of geolocators have changed the whole sphere of seabird work absolutely dramatically for all species. We can now have these minute devices which will fit on a leg, which will give us an indication every day of where the bird is. Now, we complain about the accuracy, but this is quite magnificent. This device records light levels, and then from these can work out the time of dusk and dawn. It's got a very accurate time clock. And if you've got those two things, you can work out a latitude and longitude. We have a slight problem because some of these, it doesn't work when daylight, around now, when the day length is equal to the night. I mean, it can't cope with that. And it also has problems of continual day or continual night, like in the very far north. Anyway, so these can give us a plot. Okay, it's only accurate to about 185 kilometers, but they're reasonably cheap, they're reasonably light, and we put them on a bird 1 year and we get them back the next. And what did we find? We thought, excellent. We were, this is a bird which is ringed on the Isle of Man. These are all its fixes during the winter. And it hasn't gone that far. It stayed in this part of the North Sea. So it's confirmed what we got. And you can see how small these devices actually are. That was great. And then we had a terrible shock. And this was about 10%, 20% of the birds leave the North Sea. This bird from here stayed around here for a bit, went round here, went to here, gradually worked its way towards Greenland, worked its way back, flew round, spent part of the winter off Ireland, and then went round the north here. So you can see we completely new. We just, when I first one of these, we didn't believe it at all, but then they started to come in a bit more regularly. And so we're happy with that one. We weren't happy with that one. And we put the lot together and we come up with this. So this is just one winter. And the red areas are the areas during the winter most used by Isle of May puffins. And you can see it's most of them don't go very far, and a few of them get around to here. And we compare this, what we thought. You see, these, we mistakenly thought had gone through there. We now know from a lot of birds that they all go around there to there. They don't go through there. Puffin is an extremely rare bird in the southern North Sea. Something's extremely wrong if you get puffins there. So we're making some progress. But even more spectacularly, to my mind anyway, is we start doing this at different colonies. A whole series of people have been doing this. We've pooled our data now. So this needs a little bit of explaining. Whoops. I'll come back. So this is the Isle of May, that colour, and we've just seen this is where they winter. Irish birds and Welsh birds, they go here and into the Mediterranean, a few of them. Birds from northern Norway spend a bit of time here, and a few of them go across to here. Now bear in mind that this is during the whole of the winter. There is no daylight up there whatsoever. So how do puffins catch their fish there? We haven't got a clue. I mean, you just can't see how they do it, but they obviously do manage. Then the Iceland birds from these 4 colonies, they go across in the winter here. Bay of Fundy birds stay around here. The Newfoundland birds stay around here. These birds, some go up to there and some go across to here. So even with these now, just a handful of colonies really, we've more or less found that the whole area which we thought was occupied by puffins, this being the southern, we guess, the southern edge of the range. I mean, there's plenty more colonies to fill this in. So we now know that puffins occur through this area in the winter. And we said before, we've got 20 million puffins, we think. But you never see them out there. The best records of puffins seen at sea away from the colonies was during the last World War, World War II, where 101 crossings were made by ornithologists, and these were people looking for submarines, so they were looking pretty high intensity around. In 101 crossings, they saw 6 puffins. Of those, 1 was washed aboard by a big wave. So we now know the puffins were out there, but nobody's seen them, and virtually nobody has seen a puffin in the open Atlantic since then. So why? And this is a little bit of sidetrack, really, because it interests me. This is a dive profile of a puffin. It's got a device on it, which records the depth every 3 seconds. So this is just 10 minutes from there to there. Each one of these is a dive. It doesn't go very deep, 4 meters, and we thought they would be deeper than, but see how little time it spends on the surface. You wonder when it breathes. It's all the time, it's up and down, and they do this for hours on end. It's just amazing. We've got little information in the winter as well, and you can see that they do occasionally go down to 40 meters. The vast bulk of them are very close to the surface. So almost certainly, it's a low density of puffins out there. You can do the calculation, and in fact, it works out as 1 puffin for every 1 square kilometer of ocean. And they're under the water for, what, 3/4 of the time or more? So it's not surprising we never see them, is it? But anyway, at least with devices, we are beginning now to understand the puffin when it's away from the colony. And just as a final thing, again, because it interests me, we thought that they wouldn't feed at night, and they don't dive at night. This is the first and last dive of the day, and you see this is the first dive is soon after dawn. This is where we think dawn is, where these puffins were during this month. And you can see there's not one dive in the night. Well, there's one there. And some of them sometimes don't start. But anyway, so we now know they dive lots and lots and lots. They don't dive very deep, they always dive during daylight. And we've now got some data from birds which were shot off by fowlers in the Faroes, and we know that, in fact, about a third of their diet is, in fact, small crustacea plankton from the sea surface. They don't go very deep. Another thing about puffins, they become flightless, and they drop all the primaries and all the secondaries at one time, and for a month, maybe, they can't fly. I should have pointed out, but I won't go back because I don't like going back to slides. If you remember, the Isle of May puffins, for parts of the year, they went round northern Scotland and went up towards the Faroes. There's an oil spill on at the moment from the Clare field, which hasn't made much news in this country. It hasn't made much news in this country because the oil is drifting towards the Faroe Islands. And that's where the puffins are at this time of year, some of them. And we now know almost certainly that some of them are molting and are flightless up at the moment. So maybe probably should sort of start jumping up and down. I've started. Right. Those with short memories. Can you remember all that? There was a furore about a couple of years back when all these puffins were washed up ashore. Everybody was finding dead puffins on the coast of Scotland, well, on the North Sea side. There was a lot of onshore winds. It was very cold, extreme conditions, and we ended up with a wreck of puffins. And people, again, this is Stuart Murray was up there. He lopped all these heads off some puffins on one of his beach walks, and there we got a sack full of dead puffin heads. The wreck was here, about 4,600, and it occurred in March when the birds were just starting to get back to the colonies. We looked at these birds. Normally you get half a dozen dead puffins a year on the east coast of Scotland. I mean, people know I want dead puffins in the winter, and I get very few. This year we had almost 1,000 went through our garage. So there were a lot of dead puffins around. Some were looked at, they were grossly underweight, they weren't diseased, and everything suggests that they died of starvation. So I think it's fair to assume that just these weather conditions were so bad that they couldn't feed. We've got no direct measure of their food supply, but we guess that the surface water was so churned up, the visibility wouldn't have been very good inshore, and they would have struggled. We aged all these because, there's one thing you can do with puffins, and 67% of them were birds which were capable of breeding, and these ratios here. We can work out a population structure from what we know of puffins, or what we think the age structure should be at risk at that time, and it's exactly what that is. So all the birds seem to have suffered equally. And there was concern, of course, with this many adults that surely it would have some adverse effect on the population. And here we are, having years and years and years, well, I couldn't get a puffin which was molting, and we end up with hundreds of the things. We then looked at these were, and it was quite interesting because I anticipated that more would have been molting. These are adults, so these have molted, black have not molted, these are the ones active molting, young adults and immatures. However, this is, again, what we would have expected from the structure of the population, so we don't think that this was critical in causing the mortality. So, well, the question now, we've got all these puffins. They'd just come back to the colonies. We had the first records ashore a few days before this wreck. They were then put off. The breeding that year was about 2 weeks later than normal. But they did come back, and we then wondered what had happened. Now, we've been following these colouring birds, so we know their survival from one year to another, going way back now. And there's been two things happen. One of it's the survival over the period of our study. They're not surviving as well as they used to. But more critically, there are two periods here where survival was extremely low. This one here, and there was no records at all of unusual dead puffins anywhere. Okay, they just died. This one was an even bigger wreck. There were a few found dead in Orkney and Shetland, but nothing to cause any great concern. And then we had this wreck, and look, survival that year was way up to where it normally was. Again, we were very surprised by this. So it wasn't survival. Now, just bearing in mind that I've circled that, and these two circles. Now, the Alamay population, as I said, was very small. And look what it was doing. Heaven help us, you know. It was up to 80,000. The next count, we expected to be up 100,000 or something. We calculate that there's room for about 500,000 pairs on the Alamay, so space wasn't short. But, in fact, the population has done this. So, this is the period of rapid increase we just showed you. That was the first circle. So it had very little effect. That mortality had very little effect. The second 2 years of very poor survival resulted in a serious population crash, meaning way down. There's no decline here. That's not quite true. What we think now is that these birds had increased slightly over the period. So some birds were lost, but the population had increased since we did the previous count. Now, counting puffins is not for the faint. It's not for the faint-hearted, because you've got to do this. You've got to go around and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, until you get up to about, I don't know, 50,000 or whatever it is. And you then look down a sample of them and decide what proportion are not really burrows, what proportion are burrows with 2 entrances, what proportion might have rabbits in. So it's not done. And unfortunately, manpower being what it is, we only do it every 5 years. But we did it then. So here we are, impressed. We were surprised. In fact, it didn't see any effect at all. And this is what we think has happened. Large numbers of puffins die every winter, and I've stressed they're out at sea. We know nothing about them. They just die, and they presumably sink. So the thing about the 2013 wreck was that they died where we could find them, where they got washed ashore. It wasn't the wreck was that atypical, it was the fact that where it occurred was atypical, and we could get our hands on them to look at them. So, you know, one's got to be a bit careful of carried away when you get these wrecks. On the other hand, the first decline, the really big decline, we didn't pick up in the colony until 2 years later. Because you don't see every puffin with a colouring every year. A few you miss. And we used to think that we missed them because they took a year off. They just didn't come back because conditions weren't good or whatever. But we now know that that's not true. So we won't be caught out like that again. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the next year, that was the biggest wreck of puffins ever recorded, the one around here. Then, heaven help us, the next year, there was an enormous wreck in the Bay of Biscay. Oh, up here, you can see. The same sort of mainly adults. And ringing showed us that they came from these colonies, Skocum Scoma, some of the Irish colonies, Cana, the Sheeans. None were ringed on Kilda, so we wouldn't know. Sewell Skerry, which is where most puffins are ringed these days. And not shown on here, in fact, there were 2 birds from the Isle of May as well, around there. And so this surely would have an effect on the population, but we have to admit that we don't know because those populations are not being monitored. And this is the reason that we urgently need to get another count of these really big colonies to see what's going on. So, gloom and despondency. Puffins have got bring a death wish on themselves. People always think they're in trouble, and one can cry wolf a bit too much. Anyway, the future. We've talked about the past and the present, and we see a whole series of things. Widespread declines in some places. Breeding failures, Norway, Iceland, the Faroes. Some of those colonies not reared more than a handful of chicks for the last 15 years. Now, the puffin is so long-lived, and the chicks, when they go to sea, have such a high survival that they can cope with 2 or 3 years on the trot without anybody even noticing the numbers at the colony. But now these runs are so long that the populations are starting to come down. Having said that, conditions this summer up there have been slightly better, and they have indeed reared some chicks. But anyway, certainly in Norway, we think it's mainly food shortage, but we don't know enough about it, really. We've got this increased mortality, we've talked about it, and almost certainly, wherever you are in the puffins range, the effects will be different. Quite simply, because puffins eat different fish. Puffins in northern Norway eat capelin. Central Norway, they eat herring. Down here, they eat sand eels. So you wouldn't be surprised if there were differences. Threats to puffins, well, we can go through as a whole list. We covered most of them in the past, because people have mentioned them. Hunting and harvesting, that's more or less stopped. Iceland have stopped all their hunting of puffins. Faroes have not, though there's moved to try to stop them, killing them there. Entanglement in drift nests, this doesn't seem to be important anymore. Industrial fisheries for sand eels, we don't think is that important. Introduced mammals, in a few specific cases. Invasive plants haven't helped us, like on Craigleith, Anphidra, dwarfing island leech there. Pollution, we've looked at in some great detail, and we think probably is not sufficient to have any effect on the populations. But climate change, and we've all heard quite a lot about climate change, and you're going to hear a bit more in the next 5 minutes. This is a map showing how the sea temperatures have increased in the last 30 years. And you can see the most extreme cases have been in the southern North Sea, and they're just beginning to pinch up here. Important thing as regards this is plankton, how this will affect the food supply of puffins. And one of the main food of sand eels is this Colorless Copepod. There are two species. One is warm water, the other is cold water. The cold water one is this one. It's been replaced by this one. This one is bigger than the warm water one and is more nutritious. And it does seem to be that there's been this change. We have some evidence that it interferes with the growth of sand eels. We have yet to show the link whether it carries through into the puffins, because puffins do have this alternate food supply, like sprats. And as there's a good relationship between, as the temperature basically, how conditions become less favorable, as they become less favorable for this colonus, breeding success of puffins decline. So almost certainly this will continue, I think. And just to show this, it's quite amazing, really, even if you know it, the rate the seas are warming up around here. The critical thing is the 10 degrees centigrade isotherm, and that's moving north at 22 kilometers a year. So it was here in the 60s to 80s, and it's up here now. Enormous difference. And it's not surprising that this is influencing a bird like the puffin, which has a northern distribution. It's not the temperature per se, because as we've seen, the winter in some quite warm areas, it's just acting through the food. So we can take all this data and sort of model some predictions. And this is what the predictions say. Debbie Russell at St Andrews did for part of her thesis. This model predicts, this is the distribution of puffins in 80 then, and this is what it's predicted to be in 100 years' time. So what's going to happen? Puffin will certainly become extinct in France, Channel Islands, Ireland, and England, we think. It's predicted anyway. There will be increases in northern Norway, decreases in Scotland, Ireland, and southern Norway. The crux of the matter is if you want to see puffins in Scotland in 2100, you're going to have to go further north than you do now. Now, just wind farms always come up in the business these days, don't they? And we need wind. We need to get rid of some of these fossil fuels. Nobody's doubting that. So how is this likely to impact on birds? And there's obviously a move to put wind turbines at sea around the coast of Britain. This was the proposed thing, though it's changed now. This is the proposed area of wind farms here. This is the Isle of May. What effect might this have on puffins? Well, we can do several things, can't it? It can, they can fly into it, or they can go round it. But is it likely to interfere when they're feeding chicks? Which is probably when they're most constrained, because they've got to come back to the burrow to feed the chicks. They can't feed that far away. Each puffin's got to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, 3 or 4 times a day to feed its chicks, so it can't go too far. We've tried to look at that by putting on locators, GPSs, global positioning things over the breeding season, and we find that these are the main areas where the puffins we were following were feeding, i.e. they overlap this considerably. We're not entirely happy with this, because puffins have got a lot of advantages, but one disadvantage is they don't like having little things attached to their backs. We attach these to some back feathers. And they sort of sulk. They come back to the colony, but they may not feed the chick for a day or two until they come to terms with it. So this is very suggestive, but we're not entirely happy. We would like to repeat this, but we need to get some smaller devices before we can actually go. It's probably not fair on the birds at present. Lastly, almost lastly, what you wouldn't, just to you at a personal level now, everybody wants to take pictures of puffins with fish. Great, I've got lots of puffins and pictures of fish. You don't want to see a picture like this. These puffins are sitting there because they can't get to the chicks because you were in the way. So take a picture and move on. This is something we individuals can do at a population level on something like the Isle of May. It's not that critical because there are very few puffins which people will disturb. Luckily, most people photograph puffins in the day, and the puffins feed their chicks mainly in the early morning and late evening. But anyway, if you do, try not to disturb your puffin. It wants to get to its chick. Just take your picture and move on. Right, the future. Those what sums up what I've said. There is a projection that puffin population in Europe will decline by 50% or 80% in the next 40, 50 years. That's 3 generations. 3 generations a year are not what you think, because I said puffins can actually breed at 7. Generation times in these sort of calculations are a puffin breeding, how long until that cohort that year will have produced enough chicks which have survived to come back to breed themselves. So it's not 7, it's something like 20 years. So puffins are, will I'm sure come down. But I love puffins. They've served me very well in my career. But people have been threatening doom and despondency on puffins until the start. That's why I got my job. Yes, we should look at study puffins. We should try to find out what's going on, but let's not get too carried away. I personally am not going to call a puffin endangered until we're down to our last million. There are more deserving causes, but that's a purely personal thing, of course. Right, what do we need to do? Whatever, we need a new, up-to-date count of puffins. We've got bits and pieces of counts, but we still have 3 areas which between them hold about half of Britain's puffins. Some big colonies in Shetland, Sewell Skerry there, and St Kilda. We've got to get these counted, otherwise I cannot be sure that puffin isn't endangered, nor can anybody else. So that there's a move at the moment to get a new seabird census done of all seabirds in Britain. The puffin should have fairly high priority in this. We're getting there. But what we need to do is spend time putting people onto the ground and counting the holes in the ground in some of these spectacular but inhospitable places. There are lots of other colonies scattered around, which are fairly easy counted, or you can count the birds, but together they're trivial. Everything else is lost. in the counts of shared islands here, 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 and these 3 colonies here. So once we can get that, we can have another reassessment of where we are with the puffin. I hope I'm wrong, but I personally think they're coming down, and we need to carry on studying them. So there we are. What can you personally do? Well, you can think about climate change, of course. You can keep protecting puffins on land, and the most important thing here is to make sure that things like rats and what have we, foxes don't get on them, don't get introduced onto islands. We must try to protect them more at sea and those coming along, but the big unknown is climate change. So I leave it to you to think how best you can help the puffin. So, I'm sure you've heard more than you ever wanted to hear about puffins. I'm happy to take any questions.